Just where we stopped, I was talking about the dynamics of a large group, and a large group is identified in terms of the sameness among a group of people. And when a society as a large group becomes a deliberate target of others' aggression, the victimized group or the group has to deal with 5 interrelated psychological phenomena and others related to them. One is a shared sense of shame, humiliation, dehumanization, and guilt. Another is a shared inability to be assertive, and that is really important in terms of after a war, if people are trying to negotiate and they're still seeing the other as the traumatizing oppressor, it can be very difficult to find a voice to get, the rights for your own group. A shared identification with the oppressor. And number 4, a shared difficulty or even inability to mourn losses. And that's very important in terms of how we remember and, of course, how we forget. And a shared transgenerational transmission of trauma. So I'm going to just go into the 4th and 5th one there and talk about the inability, the difficulty or inability to mourn, because it is really a very, I think it's something connected to the Irish psyche. We're always, there's many, we're a very seeking group in terms of curious and creative, but we always get back to stories about sorrow or, somehow we kind of land there. And that's an important chosen trauma that we need to understand more. So large group mourning is a key concept in explaining societal processes in everyday life during a post-trauma period. So that's after war. Sharing shame, humiliation, guilt, inability to be assertive, and identification with the oppressor complicate group mourning and in turn become the main reason for the transgenerational transmission of trauma, because the trauma isn't worked through. It's guarded against, okay? So with grief, obviously, we mourn the loss of a person. They're still vital to our remembering. And with mourning, and Freud has written about that, it's a more settling process. Mourning is more of a loss where over time we come to terms with the future where the person will no longer be present. Okay, so members of a large group that has been traumatized by others lose people, lose limbs, lose homes, lose land, lose dignity, lose prestige, lose self-esteem. After the oppressive regime is changed, such individuals struggle with losing aspects of their traumatized self and trying to modify them to fit into a new external reality. I know from my work with colleagues in Ukraine at the moment that even people can adapt over time. In the beginning of the year when we were meeting, there was a lot of anxiety. And over time, more of the conversations are becoming not so much about their anxiety. It's almost like there's a private anxiety in relation to what they're suffering, but much more about how they adapt. And I remember over 2 meetings with them that we'd more talk around generators and mobile phones in terms of what light they give, and generators in terms of electricity, particularly during the time when everything that was familiar that was gone, in that they were in darkness sometimes for 12 hours a day. And I remember a whole conversation that I listened to about that. And yet I was there while I was listening. I was really, full of sorrow and sadness in terms of what wasn't being said. But I knew that it couldn't be said at that time. They needed to show me as a cohesive group how they were managing their own anxiety. But in that, of course, you can't connect to your losses. But they have said to me many, many times, oh, Barbara, whatever we're encountering now with our friends, with our colleagues, with our, with the army, the amount of loss that we're going to have to look at after the war is colossal. We can't even look at it now. So of course, if that loss starts to reverberate in terms of a group's history, then it can get very, very stuck because of the continuation of the memories of shame, humiliation, guilt, the helpless rage, and identification with the oppressor. Their mourning processes can become very complicated and unending. Another reason why mourning can become complicated is about the survivor syndrome. Like, what's it like when you have survived and you have unresolved mourning, and maybe you're the only one of your family who has survived? And sometimes there's a rage and resentment against the people who have been lost. And that underlies a sort of self-reproach of those who have survived. And that mourning is impossible because of the need to escape from acknowledging such resentment. But of course, resilience against trauma changes from individual to individual. Societies also mourn or exhibit an inability to mourn. Like, for example, were the Germans to mourn after the Second World War, it would mean they're taking responsibilities for the war crimes of Hitler and his regime. But the Germans over time have only displayed what's called isolated regret, and then only for their own losses. Since then, various serious efforts have been made to end the speechlessness regarding the situation in Germany. I mean, that's just an example. The most difficult situation is when the tissue of a society, when everything that is familiar is destroyed, but people can't get back to a sense of the familiar. It's almost like the tissue of a community is broken. If it's not broken, the society generally comes back into what's called a process of biosocial regeneration. And I'll give you an example. I'm sure many of you remember Aberfan. In Wales, there was a big coal banked up, and the coal came and smothered many children in a school. And there was a death of 100, that was in Wales, death of 116 children and 28 adults in an avalanche of coal slurry. And 5 years later, there was a significant increase in the birth rate, mostly among women who had not lost a child themselves. The increased birth rate regenerated this traumatized society in these two neighboring villages. So it's interesting when something can be not just regressed, but something creative can also emerge. Okay, so let's move on. Sometimes when the community, the tissue of community doesn't come together, the victimized society can be in perennial mourning, and that might evolve into what is called an entitlement ideology. This happens particularly when a large group receives its independence, like after being part of an empire. Such ideologies create a shared hope that it is possible to recover what has been lost to the enemy. Thus, it justifies the society's inability to mourn. This ideology, accompanied by a shared sense of entitlement, then tries to reverse that sense of helplessness and humiliation and turn a sort of a passive attitude to assertion, and again to mourn or to take into account lost objects. And all of that is very important, even in terms of monuments, you know, the monuments that are erected after a war. Okay, so entitlement ideologies that are not worked out can continue from generation to generation, which brings us finally to the concept of transgenerational transmission of trauma. Now, I can say pieces about this, but I can include it in the next talk as well when we're talking about this trauma. So, of course, transgenerational transmission of trauma owes a great deal to studies made of the second and third generations of Holocaust survivors and others directly traumatized under the Third Reich. But in terms of looking at this, in terms of the basic relationship between a mother and child, they're looking now at what's called attachment. It's a very big study in terms of psychology and psychoanalysis, is attachment and how attachment occurs. Attachment, I mean, the best attachment to have is what's called a secure attachment. It's where you basically trust the world, where you believe that you can move and be assertive in relationship, that your no and yes is heard, and that you can grow up and develop in a way where you can accomplish whatever you need, accomplish, and what your desire is. But there's other forms of attachment due to, which I won't go into, but just to say, there's what's called a disorganized attachment, and that's more in the realm of ADHD sometimes, or it's in the realm of someone that wasn't attended to in terms of relationships, and the early relationships, not just with the mother, but with the father and the family. So there's different forms of attachment, but what I'm talking about here is about the relationship between the mother and child at times of trauma. Many studies have shown that there's a fluidity between a child's psychic boundaries and those of the mother and other caretakers. And it's almost like the best way to think about it. And you can see it if you see, parents and a child when they're really close. It's almost that it's like the parental relationship and the mother's relationship with the child becomes kind of like an incubator for the child's developing mind. Now, the other side of that is that when there's trauma, the caretaker from the older generation can also transmit undesirable psychological elements to the child. One of the best known examples of a relatively simple negative form of transgenerational trauma comes from early work with Anna Freud in terms of her observations of women and children during the Nazi attacks on London. She noted that infants under 3 did not have as much anxiety during the bombings unless their mothers were afraid. And so if the mothers were afraid, they showed many symptoms of a lot of anxiety. And so there's many forms of transgenerational trauma. Besides anxiety, depression, elation, or worries, there are various psychological tasks that one person might assign to another in terms of transgenerational trauma. And what I'm talking about here is not something conscious. They talk about it in terms of a deposit. It's like a deposit. It's like some children, that they're listening to stories, and I'll give an example. I was involved in a design project once in terms of looking at people's houses, in terms of where they might place, what color they might use, where furniture is placed. And the person I was working with said that's very hard to, for people to know what it is they want. And what we did, we had the idea of, when I talked to him, we had the idea that, and I'm sure you know this, but it's changed over time, the idea of a lost room. And a lost room in a house is a room perhaps that are deposited, Granny's couch or Delph belonged to, a family. And it's obvious that it needs to be moved. Now, in terms of sustainability, maybe it will change some of that. That's a cultural change in terms of moving on. But it was the one room that people didn't know how to be in. It was almost kept, kept for something. Kept for what? What is that a reenactment of, It struck me, it was really very difficult. And sometimes the answer, if you ask people, where's the center of the house? That in a way brought them back to themselves, brought them back to where it was that they really inhabit, not what they're haunted by in terms of the objects that belong to another generation. So I've talked about another interesting thing around transgenerational transmission. I found this very interesting, is that sometimes there's what is called a whole dynamic around a replacement child. And a replacement child is an interesting dynamic and sometimes around adoption, the same dynamics can arise. So, for example, a child dies soon after the mother becomes pregnant again, and the second child lives. The mother deposits her image of the dead child, including her deep feeling relationship with the child, into the developing identity of the second child. The second child now has the task of keeping this deposited identity within him or herself, and there are different ways for the child to respond to this task. So In a situation like that, the child may adapt to being a replacement child by successfully absorbing what has been deposited. And that's usually maybe if there's been a more secure attachment. Alternatively, the child may develop a double identity, experience what we would call is like a more fragmented sense of self. And in psychiatric terms, we'd be talking about a borderline personality organization. Or, and this is also what can happen, or the second child may be doomed to trying to live up to the idealized image of the dead sibling, becoming obsessively driven to excel. Now that's that's an idea in terms of transgenerational transmission, but particularly in a family. All right, I'll just move on now. So I'm nearly finished. Okay. Yeah, I think this is interesting, that leadership. What we need to keep in mind is that some leaders influenced by fantasies of trauma or chosen trauma or the selected child become reparative leaders who increase the self-esteem of their ethnic, national, religion, or ideological large groups without hurting and destroying or oppressing another small group, another large group. Okay, but we know leaders make decisions that cannot always be explained by conventional, rational approaches to international decision making. When the individual psychology of a decision maker is agitated by external factors in the political environment, emotions and psychodynamic responses, whether acknowledged or not, can drastically influence the outcome. On the other hand, decision makers who have an agitated internal world may make decisions that attempt to affect or change the external world in order to find a solution for that leader's unconscious needs or wishes. I mean, obviously, Trump is a good example of that. So, okay, so I'm just going to summarize the whole lot now. So I just want to finish that piece around transgenerational transmission and to say there's a new growing study in terms of in recent years, a growing number of psychoanalysts, developmental psychologists, and traumatologists have turned to attachment theory in their efforts to understand the transmission of trauma. And as I said, that it's so important in terms of a secure attachment, that in a way, you know, it doesn't disturb the ground in terms of the transmission. In a way, maybe there's more in the child, so nothing can be deposited. But obviously, if you have an attachment that's an empty attachment, that is less in terms of what you've received from the early environment. People like that are more fragile and more open to carrying what's deposited within them. Okay, so just to summarize, the transgenerational transmission of trauma from generation to generation may lead to a shape of what we've called a chosen trauma. A chosen trauma refers to the shared stories or mental representation of an event in a large group history in which the group suffered a huge loss or humiliation or helplessness at the hands of enemies. As I explained earlier, when members of a victim group are unable to mourn losses associated with the massive trauma, or to reverse the humiliation and helplessness, or become assertive, they pass on to their offspring, the children and the children's children, the images of their injured self, and therefore certain psychological tasks then need to be completed. All such images and tasks that are handed down contain references to the same historical event. And as decades pass, the mental representation of this event links all the individuals in the large group. Thus, the event's historical narrative emerges as a significant large group identity marker. And so a chosen trauma can exist for centuries. And then whenever a new possibility, a new ethnic, a new religion or political crisis developed within the society, its leaders intuitively rekindle memories and feelings of chosen traumas in order to consolidate the group emotionally and ideologically. Political leaders may initiate the reactivation of chosen traumas in order to fuel entitlement ideologies. And I'll just finish with this. A striking example of this is the behavior of Slobodan Milosevic and his group before the Serbs' war with Bosnian Muslims in 1990 to 1991, and again before the conflict with Kosovo for Albanians in 1998. He went back to an early narrative 600 years ago about, and he reactivated the memory of what was called the Battle of Kosovo. And that was 600 years ago. There was one of the kings that was involved in that battle. He reactivated him and talked about how he looked like Jesus. And what he did, so as the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo approached, the remains of Prince Lazar, the Serbian leader, captured and killed at the Battle of Kosovo, were exhumed. For a whole year before the atrocities began, the coffin traveled from one Serbian village to another, and people mourned and wailed as if it had happened yesterday. And then he used that in terms of to activate an entitlement ideology, even though they were only 10% of the population at that time. And we know the rest of the story in terms of the killing that occurred. Okay, so just one last question. There's many questions and I've left out quite a bit. But I think it's very important. There's one or two comments I want to make. To be able to really know the difference between when we're acting from a chosen trauma and where things are just opening out in terms of trauma and can't be closed down. And the distinction between that and an emerging ideology. An emerging ideology in a society, or an emerging political ideology. Is that political or emerging ideology based on values, of truth and justice? And that's why it's so important to have legal systems. Or is that ideology underneath something that seems very new and shiny, is underneath that a reactivation of trauma? And is the ideology in the service of a chosen trauma? And that's so important. And next time I will talk a bit more about that, but I'll also talk about ways through in terms of commemoration. And as Michael D would talk about, an ethical remembering. Thank you.